Welcome, everybody, to episode 5 of Economics Happy Hour. My name's Matt Rosu.
And I'm Jadrian Wooten.
Thrilled to have you join us again, and glad we're here for episode 5. And Jadrian, this is going to drop right before the Super Bowl, but today, first day of classes.
And it was a wild first day of classes. So I taught my first sports economics course in almost a decade. So that one was fun. And then my other one was my big principles class with like 500 people. It's still fun, but just a completely different energy to go from like 30 students in the morning to 530 in the afternoon.
I remember I had a macro class that 35 was the cap for macro, which is higher than our micro, and I think I let 2 overloads in, so I had 37. And I was like, this is so many students. I can't even fathom the 5. Well, I mean, as you know, I mean, it requires a completely different approach.
Yes. And I think that's actually the hardest thing for me, is mostly because like I have to change my personality from like the morning to the afternoon, where I'm like in the morning I have to calm down, be a little not as big. If I come in with that same energy with 30 people, they'd freak out. With the 500, I'm like animated and my arms are moving and all sorts of stuff. That's the hardest part. So by the end of it, I'm exhausted, but not because of how big the class is, just because like of just personality changes during the day.
That's fair. And so you are in your office, so I assume it's a non-alcoholic beverage. Do you have a beverage available for today?
I do have a bottle of water because I've decided to start. I need to do better. So I've downloaded an app to help me track my water intake and make sure that I'm actually drinking water. You would also appreciate this. My afternoon beverage choice,
Diet Coke. I like it.
Was a Diet Coke, because I'm also trying to cut back on the amount of sugar that I do. Yeah. So some of that could be. I came back. My belt loop was a little tighter coming back from that cruise.
Coming back from a cruise. I had 4 days in Disney, and I the average steps I had was 26,500. Mine, I'm still in dry January, and I have become a huge fan. The first one I had of a Virgin Mule was on our last podcast, but the Virgin Moscow Mules, it's kind of like I'm having a drink, but without the alcohol. So it's that's what my drink is tonight. And those who recall, I had an exception for Disney, so I did have a few beverages in Disney, including a few local Florida beers, which I entered into Untapped. If anybody's started following me on Untapped yet, and I don't think anybody has.
No. Which ones did you check in? I'm kind of curious now.
I have to look it up. One of them was like exclusive to Walt Disney World Swan.
Okay,
that wasn't so great.
Did y'all just do Disney, or did you do Universal
just
too?
Disney? Arrived on a Sunday, left on a Thursday, so we did one park a day. I've done Universal in the past.
I'm a Universal. I love Universal. Disney has its own magic, but I love just the themes in each of the Universal parks, and the fact that like I can go to the Simpsons world and like have a Duff beer and eat at the taco truck, like just like those sorts of little, like my favorite Disney park is Epcot, because I can match the food with the place. And so I feel like Universal does that with other stuff.
It's funny because I mean, I always think of theming, and I think Disney does as you say, magical. I think their theming is so strong in terms, like we went to Avatar Land and they have a little Avatar style restaurant, and I still don't know exactly what I ate, but it looked like it could have been an Avatar, and it was really tasty. So
yeah, I think it's definitely, I think they've gotten better about that. And I think my guess is a lot of it probably comes from Universal's Harry Potter world, where like those were just so overwhelming like experiences that they're like, oh yeah, we need to probably do this too.
Which is a pretty awesome spot. I mean, I don't disagree. I love Universal too. So a couple of the beers, Fins and Feathers was one from, and then Lone Palm Golden Ale from the Cask and Larder.
You had some like real local craft ones.
Yeah, some local craft from Florida. One was Hakuna Matata. And I'm like, okay, apparently that phrase, I guess it's just a phrase. It can't be copyrighted, but we were, that was interesting. So yeah, I had a few different craft beers over the times, and cheers with your, I mean, I don't know if it's the same with your water, but
I was able to check in some local. I really, maybe not local. I guess in like in these types of islands, it's like the national beer of the Bahamas, the national beer of Puerto Rico.
Very
So I was
cool.
able to get some checks and some badges that like of actual like new beers that I'm never gonna have again. I had
Yeah.
like the main beer of Haiti, and so that was I'll probably never have that again, and I'll never find it anywhere else.
That's very cool though. That's
Yeah,
cool to get those local ones. So glad the cruise was good. That's good.
yeah.
Someday economics of cruising should be a podcast. It's complicated enough, but today the goal, this is dropping a few days before the Super Bowl, talking a little bit about the economics behind the Super Bowl and the economic impact of the Super Bowl. Given you kicking off your sports economics class, this is kind of,
Yeah,
I feel like we have the expert here.
yeah. I don't know about the expert, but I would say it is. So I think it's fascinating in the sense that I don't know if there is maybe this is a challenge for you. I'm not sure that there's an economic concept or application that like the general public disagrees with economists more than the economic impact of like sporting events, stadiums, stuff like that. I know we're not going to talk about stadiums, but like sporting events in general. I feel like the general public is like, yes, let's have a Super Bowl. It's going to bring in visitors. We're going to make so much money. And like nearly every economist is like, no, it's not like that. Like, I feel like it's on the economist side. Like almost all economists agree on this. And so like you have like consensus among the economists with like disagreement on the other side.
I agree with you on the stadiums themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Super Bowl clearly has an impact for the town that has it, right? I mean, like they bring in a lot of visitors.
No, not really. No. So, okay. So here's the thing, right? So so there's like levels to it, right? So it's like how you measure economic impact. So, in a sense, so like the way that I always did it with like the Penn State version, because like when Penn State football shut down during the pandemic, when there was no fans, there's all these people in the news that are like, oh my God, this is going to ruin the state college economy. Penn State football brings in $100 million of revenue, right? That was always I think it was 100 million was the big number that they put out. It's like there's like levels to it in a sense. Like I like went in and like looked up the data on like when a Penn State football game happened. So we'll go real local, right? So instead of like the Super Bowl, right? The Super Bowl is always in a major city, right? Like Atlanta, Los Angeles, small in a big pond. So like if it's true, then you would definitely expect it in a state college example where like Beaver Stadium's twice the size of the city. But like I looked it up and like state college, like their regional tourism, like money coming in is in the billions, not in the millions. So Penn State football said that they brought in $100 million, but like the city generates billions every year. So like percentage wise, relatively small. But then the other part is like how that spending actually happens. So we normally think about it as like, okay, they're staying in a hotel, they're going to get food and stuff like that. But what ends up happening, like there's a lot of people who go to the game. Absolutely. Right. Like they're coming in, they're going to stay in a hotel and they're going to go. But there are a lot of people who just drive to the game and then drive home.
Sure.
They come just for the game and then they leave. They buy their gas, not in State College. They buy it in Harrisburg, Philadelphia. They drive there. They pay for tailgating, pay for the football ticket, and then drive home. But like they don't buy groceries there. They buy groceries in Philadelphia and bring them. They buy their alcohol in Philadelphia and bring it. And so like they're not actually spending that much. They might pay for parking. They might pay for some drinks, maybe some food at a restaurant. But the other thing, and really the key big part is like if you think about like hotel prices shoot up during the Super Bowl. Hotel prices shoot up during college football games. But if you're staying at a Hilton, a big chunk of that money doesn't stay in the town. It goes back to the Hilton headquarters. So like hotel rooms might be twice as expensive, 3 times as expensive, but like the maids and the housekeeping staff aren't getting paid 2 and 3 times their normal rate. They're getting paid their general amount, and that kind of excess profit leaves the area instead of stays in the area. And so it's like the hard part is always like people measure spending and they're like, oh, look how much money they spent, but they don't realize that like a lot of that leaves, right? Like if you go to Cracker Barrel for your dinner some of that money's going back to the Cracker Barrel headquarters. And so like that's where like that disconnect comes in of like how much is spent versus how much of an impact it really makes.
So I think I literally agree with every single thing you said, but I still think there's an impact that's not trivial when Penn State hosts a home football game, right? I mean, there are, let's say it's 10,000 fans who do decide, you know what, we're going to grab a meal, either a lunch or a dinner in town before, and every hotel room is indeed sold out. And others might roam the town, and some people will buy gas in the town. So I think to me, 100%, there is an impact, and it's positive.
I got you. Watch this, because you know
overstated.
You know this answer, right? Absolutely, there will be people who do that. But in State College, there are also people who live there that leave during a football game, and we're not even just to rent out, right? Like they don't want to be around the crowds and see all the people. And so they go, you know what? I'm going to eat my dinner. I'm going to leave and go. They go the other direction. Like they go to Philly and they're like, let's spend a weekend in Philly to get away from this mess.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden their normal spending moves over somewhere. So it's almost like a substitution. So people will switch those spots.
So I've written a fair amount on economic impact study, more on issues with fracking.
Yeah.
But I've actually done a couple for higher ed. The substitutions are key, right?
Yeah.
Both directions. So if somebody's coming to the game at State College, but they were going to come anyway, that's really no impact. If somebody's going to leave on a vacation to Philly, but they were going to go to Philly at some point during the year, they're just choosing that. That's not really a negative impact. That's just the timing. So I have a Super Bowl one. If you just type in economic impact Super Bowl, you'd find it, and we can link to this. It's from the most recent one. It was published in October 21 by a firm. Now, one of the big issues I have with economic impact studies, and there's perverse incentives essentially. Some organization, which in this case I'm sure was the County of Los Angeles and City of Inglewood, as it says it there. Some entity of those folks hired Micronomics. They have the three authors there listed there to come up with a study, and they're not hiring them to come up with a small number.
No,
at all. They're not hiring them to do that. And so you've got this really terrible incentive right off the bat. It's not, there's no peer review on these things. It's PR piece and trying to hide into the research, but some of the things that these things always get wrong. One are substitution effects. How much would have happened anyway? The Super Bowl, I think there's going to be a little bit less than normal. I think you're going to get a lot of people who are coming from out of town, who will go to the hotels, who will go to the restaurants, who will be local that wouldn't have been there otherwise. But some of the other things, there's the question of how much stays in the area. What's the
multiplier? Yeah, I didn't even mention the multiplier, right? That's the worst. I think that's the worst economic concept to teach somebody. That's a good pause, right? So like one of the big things on impact studies is known as the multiplier effect, and it is the idea. I'll see if I can broadly summarize this, and I think I can do it. If I spend $1 somewhere, it's not actually just $1, because when I spend $1 at let's say I give Matt $100 for his apartment, Matt is going to take that $100 and spend some more of it. He's going to save some of it, spend some more of it. So my $100 gets multiplied in the economy. So that's kind of I would say a broad way to describe the multiplier effect.
Correct. Yeah. Thinking about it on a simple basis, if you saved $100 next month on gas money, okay, you're $100 richer. If you spend, if you are let's say a server at a restaurant and everybody just saved $100, well, you saved the $100, but because everybody in town has $100 more, you're going to make more money because more people are going to come to your restaurant. You're going to get more tips. You're going to get more hours, right? Yeah, it's multiplied. The multipliers generally can be overstated, and there's a huge. It gets a little technical, but how many? What area are you looking at, right? If you're looking at the economic impact on the state of California, okay, a lot of it's going to stay within the state of California, but then also a lot of the people traveling to the Super Bowl probably were from California. So all of a sudden that should just be removed. And a lot of the studies don't do that. They will essentially double count. They'll on the specific things. So for higher ed, we're in a rural area. In many ways, that makes things a bit easier. If we're doing the 4-county area, okay, there's not that many people who, if they're at Susquehanna, they would have been at another school in the 4-county area. So we're pretty comfortable with that. But then if you're saying, what's the impact on the state of Pennsylvania? Well, the multiplier is larger. However, many of those students would have gone somewhere else in Pennsylvania. And that's a trick to figure out that people who do it right, it's, can credit that, but some places don't really have the incentive to do it right. And that's problematic.
So that's always the tough part about, like, you kind of just said the PR side of it. So I pulled up the Super Bowl one that you were looking at, and I started to laugh in the middle of you talking because I found something in their number that I found just, in my opinion, laughable as an assumption. And so that's the thing. There's like, these are all built on assumptions. Like, what's the multiplier? How much is a hotel going to cost? How long are they going to stay there? Yep. So if you look at table 1, that's the one I started laughing at.
Yep.
So it says that they believe there'll be 100,000 out of town visitors, which the NFL stadium doesn't even hold 100,000 people. I don't think there's that many people coming just to be in the city of the Super Bowl. They have like pre-Super Bowl events and stuff like that, but like I'm not traveling to the city if I don't want to deal with more expensive hotels, worse traffic at a busy time to not see the Super Bowl. So like those sorts of numbers feel too high. The hotel room rate, whatever. The one that made me laugh while you were talking is that green one, where they actually assumed that the average daytime spending per person per day was $200 on the lower end. And I cannot imagine going on because I travel to football game. I go to all these places, not counting the hotel room. I'm not spending $200 per day every day on food and food, gas, memorabilia. And especially like if you think you and your friend are going to go, are the two of you spending $400 per day every day that you're gone?
Yes, it depends where you eat, depends how much you drink, depends what you buy.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one jersey, right? I mean,
so that's the thing is I think you can spend that. I don't think that that's a true average spending per day. I don't know. To me, the 100,000 seems a bit stronger of an assumption. 100,000 from out of town, that seems like a stronger one. And actually, when I first read that, I thought it was 100,000 hotel nights, and I'm like, okay, people, the stadium holds 80,000, and 100,000 hotel nights makes sense. But then you look before, they're assuming 3 nights at a hotel. For those 100,000. Right, all these are built on those assumptions, right? Like if I cut down this is actually I think a perfect example of it. If I cut down that average spending assumption from 200 to 100, their whole economic impact gets slashed in half. And so it's like you get the not even just multiplier effects and like how much that money is changing. You can blow up this economic impact with just like those sorts of assumptions.
So that to me, there's both the indirect. They have indirect and induced effects, which to me maybe is that like indirect part 2. I don't quite know what they're saying on the induced effects. I have issues with that. And I don't know what the right number is. Quite frankly, maybe that's an accurate number, but maybe not. The one that a lot of studies do that I find just laughable, I guess. I don't know what else to say. And this is common across all studies. They're saying, like, hey, we're using, we use this software implant. Means it's good. Which is basically like saying, hey, you can trust my numbers. I plug them into Microsoft Excel. And so therefore it's right. Everything I'm saying is right because I used Excel, and it's everybody. And I hate to pick on this one study. They're doing the standard stuff, right? They're trying to say, hey, this is all good because of implant. As I'm sure it's going to be a shock to the audience, but I haven't been hired to do an economic impact study in quite a while with the way I'm tearing these apart, right? Like, the places that have been okay with it are, okay, this is so super obvious. We just need somebody to put, we'd like an economist to put their name to it, but
well, so here's the other thing too, right? So like a lot of these are focused on spending, which spending on the visitors coming in, right? Because that's the idea of the economic impact. And like when you give your example of like Susquehanna, like it kind of fits in that story. But the other thing that happens is there are a lot of costs of hosting the Super Bowl. So whenever the Super Bowl's in town, like the amount of police that they need just ramps up. So like spending on police services for fire service, like all of that stuff just goes way up. Those costs almost never get factored in because it's spending by the city, but it's not like that's part of that indirect spend. They're like, we don't look at this on the costs of things. And so those are things that just kind of shrink down those numbers. It's a lot. The way that I always try to kind of really highlight it is I really pick on the hotel one because I think that's the easiest one, is because it's that money, not all that money stays there. And like a lot of the impact of like the impact studies assumes that the money stays there and multiplies. And like they don't ever really think about these like leak out effects of like Hilton is sending half of this money back to New York as part of their profits of operating a hotel. That kind of gets lost in the story. And so I think it's a much smaller impact where it has a real meaningful impact. So whether it's like the World Cup, whether it's the Super Bowl, like all of these tend to find like it's not worth it because the cities have to bid on it. The cities are like paying the NFL to let them host it and things like that. The place that like, I guess this is going to go back. I think Amanda laughed at this the last time we said it. So hopefully she'll appreciate this again. Economists aren't good with feelings. And like the biggest payoff of Super Bowls, World Cups, Olympics is that it makes people happy. And it makes people happy for a very long time. That like they're really proud that their city had the Super Bowl or the World Cup. And like that's the real impact is you get to brag about going to it if you're a local or that your city hosted it. But when politicians fight for those things, they never say, bring it, we're going to be happier. They go, bring it, we're going to improve hotels and restaurants and all sorts of stuff.
Well, and it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, sports stadiums are clearly much more negative economic impact, or any economic impact is way overstated, even if their impact isn't quite negative.
Yeah.
But this is, I think, talking about almost like public choice and government failures. A politician doesn't pay the costs of that, right? I mean, they of course they pay taxes like everybody else, but to be able to build it, it's something they'll absolutely brag about.
Yeah,
and kind of
you need 50% plus one to like the idea, and if you can get the majority to think it's cool, go for it. So this is actually, as a sports economist, I'm very different than a lot of the other sports economists. Like we all kind of recognize like these are not good as an investment, right? I think I've written about this before. I don't like that they're called investing in stadiums or investing in the World Cup because like they're very poor investments. I don't have a problem with cities paying to host it. Like there are plenty of things that cities spend money on that don't generate revenue at all. Right? Like you could build a park, it's never going to generate revenue. You're not making money off of your city parks. So at least if you're going to host a stadium, you're going to generate some money to pay for the costs. I think it's always one of those. I think about like my personal budget. Every dollar I spend is not on investing. I spend some of my money going to sporting events, watching movies, things that are just purely consumptive. But I don't ever look at that and be like, oh man, I don't think about it as like, that's a great investment in the local economy. I'm just like, I'm having a good time. So I am in favor of new stadiums and stuff like that. I don't have a problem even with cities spending money on it, mostly because it's not my city. So I don't pay for it. And I like to go to the stadiums, and I like to go to a really nice fancy stadium instead of like rundown RFK stadium, which is being torn down. So
to build a new publicly subsidized or that.
No, well, they're talking.
They're already in a different one now.
They're in
FedEx Field.
FedEx Field, which needs to come down. It's also it's a garbage. I don't know if you ever saw this video from the fall. There's like a video of like a pipe burst, and it's just like raining down on fans. There's a guy with a beard just standing there, like, this is it. I went to FedEx Field last year, maybe for a preseason game.
Okay.
Shocked at how bad that stadium is.
I was there in 2017, and I don't remember the stadium being awful, but I did not go to as many as you do, certainly. But it was what I was shocked at is I'm a Vikings fan, and half the stadium was Viking. Maybe not quite half, but it was a lot of the stadium. It was I was kind of surprised at, and they closed off the upper decks, and like so little fan support there. Although I guess I know I have a friend here who's a pretty big fan of the Commanders, and the I think a lot of that fan base is so disgusted with their owner. It's been
so I have a theory behind this. Actually, I'm that's definitely part of it, I think. But the other part, like I noticed this when I go to Baltimore. So in Baltimore, like I would go to the Astros games when they played the Orioles. Same thing. Like 3/4 of that stadium was Astros jerseys. Like the first time I went to an Astros Orioles game, I was super nervous because I go to sporting events regularly, but I never really get to see my team. And this was like the first chance, like I was decked out in my Astros jersey. They hadn't gotten caught cheating yet. But so like, I was like super nervous because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be like one person out of thousands. And like, not at all. Like I showed up and it's just, it's orange, Astros orange, walking into the stadium. And I was like, this is kind of cool. It felt like a little Astros home game.
Yeah.
And I've only ever been to the Baltimore one where I can think about that. I have a theory behind it. And my best theory for that is that in the that DC Baltimore area, I feel like population wise, a large percentage of the people who live in that area aren't from that area. And like, I feel like because of DC, right, there's so many people moving from all these different cities to DC. And like, I feel like if you're born in that area, you try to leave, right? I feel like that's one where people are leaving. And then with all the just political stuff, like people are coming in, where I feel like if you work in DC, you get like, oh, your team is in Baltimore.
It's going to come visit. Yep.
You're going to go. Like, I'm going to go because my team is there. Versus
whereas,
like,
Buffalo has far fewer people from around the world, right? Therefore,
right. And so like Buffalo is just going to get Buffalo fans the entire time. Yeah. And so I've only ever experienced that in DC and Baltimore. That's never happened anywhere else I've been. If I go to a Houston game, I went to a Houston soccer game in Philadelphia. It was like, there's like 5 of us total out of 20,000. And I was like, they were mostly nice. They didn't throw batteries at me. So that was good.
Not having batteries thrown, I think, is a good minimum qualification.
Hey, Philadelphia's mean.
Yeah. I have heard and been warned not to go as an opposing fan. So, anything more, or should we talk about scholarship here for a paper or two to highlight today?
Well, so I was going to go through. So as you were talking earlier, so there has not been a lot of recent updates on kind of economic impacts of stuff. So I was kind of looking through stuff while you were talking earlier too. And this is one of those weird things, like it almost like 10, 15, 20 years ago, like they kind of settled that these are not that great. And then like they really haven't done much since then. Mostly because like there's not any new data or anything. So I went through and I pulled up a friend of mine who is like the guy in this space. Well, there's 2 of them, but Victor is like the person on economic impacts of sports, stadiums, things like that. So it's Victor Matheson and Robert Body. They have a paper, their kind of key big one looks at, let me see if I can find it real quick. So it's called Padding Required, Assessing the Economic Impact of the Super Bowl. They have evidence from host cities from 1970 to 2001 indicates that the Super Bowl contributes approximately 1/4 of what boosters have promised, and that the game could not have contributed by any reasonable standards or statistical significance more than $300 million to host cities. So like on the top end, right, 300 million. But the problem, and I think that's kind of what we were starting with, is like these impact plans, the ones that the PR people put out, they're like, we're going to get $1 billion from hosting the Super Bowl. And then you just start going, yeah, but you're not going to get 100,000 people. They're not going to spend $200. Like you start cutting that stuff down.
Yeah.
And so my comment kind of in the beginning was like on the framing side, right? So like, if it's 300 million, you have like 1 we can call it one weekend. I think that's fine. But if I were to look at the GDP, so you can look at, I think it's the Bureau of Economic Analysis does GDP by metro areas. I think they may go all the way down to county levels. So I pulled up just now while we were talking. So granted, these are a little older, right? So like that was 2001 and it was 300 million. So we would have to make some adjustments up. But so I pulled up the BEA's estimate of Los Angeles count. Let me get sure it's county. In 2021, the GDP of LA County was $711 billion. And so like right on the top end, I don't know, maybe we'll round up and say 500 million with inflation, right? You got millions out of billions. And I think that's always where like right, there's something, there is something there, but like it's statistically significant. It's not economically significant. That it's like a drop in the bucket and you're like, ooh, we're better.
And as you say, there's the impact, and even Victor's paper that's talking about the impact and not necessarily assessing the costs that are associated with it. But, I mean,
that's the struggle, right? It's like I want it to be meaningful. I think we forget how much activity happens like every day that we never notice, right? Like your cars are getting oil changes and people are getting haircuts and the grocery store selling groceries and like you're like, it's almost like throwing $100 in a pot over and over and over and over and over again. Like that's how much money is happening regularly. And like one event looks really important, but is generally really, really small. Let me see if I can find the Penn State one, and I can tell, since we started with that as my example.
Well, while you talk about that, I mean, I'll throw up, and for those watching, we'll put it on the screen, and if you're tuning in, we'll put it into the descriptions. But I had a paper published a few years ago, International Advances in Economic Research. It's on fracking, but it's guidelines for conducting economic impact studies. But it goes through a lot of the issues that you do see in these studies that we've talked about. They can be rampant with double counting. What is the defined area that you're thinking about? What is the appropriate multiplier? Some of the studies, some of it's almost laughable. You know, the multipliers can range from, it's 1.6 to 11. You know, like, no, it's not 11 times multiplier. That's not happening. But so that was some research with Dave Ramsaran, who's a professor of sociology at the time, and he's actually now my boss. He's the provost at Susquehanna. And Dylan Furlano, who's a student at the time of the research and is now kind of killing it in the real world.
All right, so I got the data for you.
Okay.
So this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. I had the title and then it disappeared. Essentially, so the vice president of Penn State during the pandemic said that there's a forecast of $100 million loss to the region because if they didn't play football or if things were going to. And it was basically like they basically did an economic impact study. And it was like, I actually think that it was the Center County Visitors Bureau or the Tourism Bureau was the one that had put it together. But right, same process. They said, here's how many hotels there are. Here's how many people. It's always full. Here's the money. And they went through that same process. And I had written a response to that. I was not popular. It was one of those very dangerous things where you're like, crap, like, I need to do this. I need to say something. Because like, I can't, right? Because I talked to my students about this. Like, I think people are comfortable with hundreds. I understand what hundreds are. I understand what thousands are. I can't process millions, right? Like, I don't know what $1 million looks like. I don't know what 1 million people look like. Like, I think we get trapped by I can't think of the name of it now, the scale.
Sure.
And so I would always tell my students, I'm like, man, $100 million, you hear that number, you're like, holy crap, that is so much money. So I pulled up the BEA numbers for State College. Their GDP in Center County, so I gave the whole county, not just even the city, $7.8 billion is how much is being produced in that area. And I'm not good enough with all the zeros to factor it out. Small. Like it's small.
Well, 100 million is a little over 1% of that, right?
Yeah. So but that's
I
the argument
don't
is like,
I don't think
it's,
it's 1% loss. I don't think it was that high.
and I don't think it's right. It's not that high. And it goes back to that kind of those stories, right? Is like, yes, they're spending that money at hotels, but some of that money's not staying at the hotel.
Yeah.
So it's one of those like they lost $100 million of spending, but not $100 million. So like that's what I had brought up,
Yeah.
and I was like, this isn't as big of a deal as you think. Like, you know, a city and a county do so much more than just like a couple weekends out of the year. And so what, like the way that I had phrased it to them, I said, you want to have a real economic impact of what you're studying? It's not missing 7 home football games. The economic impact was like not having students come back to campus.
Oh, that was brutal. Yeah.
That's what they like, nobody was talking about that. They were like, well, we're going to lose 7 football games. And I was like, the bigger deal is you lose 40,000 residents. I go, if they're spending even just $5 a day, $10 a day, like you're losing $500,000 every day of spending. That adds up. And students are spending more than $10 a day in the area. I go, you lose that, you lose daily spending. But right, that wasn't the point of their article, so they didn't want to talk about it. Even when they talked about like they would lose $100 million, it was all they only talked about revenue. They said they're gonna lose $100 million of spending, and I was like, that doesn't matter. That doesn't really matter. Like people are still gonna get paid. Like you still paid. Like Coach Franklin still got paid during the pandemic season.
Sorry. So I mean, I guess our take-home message: like, enjoy the game, have fun,
enjoy it.
Whether you go there, but it's not this killer. Glendale and the greater Phoenix area, they're getting a little bit of a boost, but it's dramatically overstated in everywhere that we see.
Yeah, it's accept and happiness, right? Like I really want to. I always want to try to highlight that because, especially the studies that looked at the World Cup and the Olympics, it's not even like a short-term happiness. It's a long-term happiness. Like they're happy then, and like weeks later, months later. I think trying to remember the last one I saw for the London one. I want to say that like happiness lasted for like 2 or 3 quarters of just like markedly happier people on like just different metrics and stuff. Yeah. So like people have long-term happiness before it returns back to their normal level. There's also some health benefits. Like this is going to go completely different. Sports tends to decrease the probability of like suicides. In some area there's like trade-offs, right? So like sports tends to increase domestic violence but decrease suicide, so there's a little pro and con side there, but generally like I think the happiness stuff gets undersold. I think we've talked about this when we talked about the GDP episode a couple times before. We're not good at measuring people's happiness in terms of like value that's created. That definitely has spillover effects, multiplier effect, like those things. I wish we probably knew more about those things than all the other stuff we know about.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So do you have a pop culture reference in mind that's related to what we're talking about today?
Well, so do you want to I could do book one, or I could do the paper. If you want to do the paper one, you can do you know Abdullah and Darshak's paper?
Yeah, using ESPN 30 for 30.
You do that one first. I'll tell you I'll give you my I really shouldn't call it pop culture, but I'm going to call it pop culture on mine.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, it's Southern Economic Association using ESPN 30 for 30 to teach economics. Abdullah El-Bahraini, and Abdullah, I'm sure I'm butchering your last name again, so I'm sorry. And Darshak Patel. And Abdullah, I think we can link if you're watching on YouTube. He's got a great YouTube channel for those who are not familiar with it. Although I suspect at this point in the podcast, many are. Hopefully down the line, many will be new. But it's using film clips from 30 to 30 to teach economics. But I go to Critical Commons and I type in ESPN, and you know whose name pops up? Yeah, it's yours. It's not theirs.
It's mine. I can explain that one.
Several clips from the Broke series, which I remember seeing that, and I read a book from a Raiders first round draft pick. The demands on pro athletes for when they get a big contract, oftentimes from family members, is so stunningly sad And you get a number of individuals who aren't used to having a lot of money, and it's not like they worked a little bit and learned how to get more and more money throughout their life, and then now they have $1 million. And many end up going broke, which is just a horrendous tragedy.
That is, I haven't watched all of the 30 for 30s. I really only watched the ones that I thought I would be interested in. But of the ones I've watched, that to me is one of the most moving ones of all of them. Right, like there's extra parts to that. So right, like demands from your family, all of a sudden, like everybody needs a cut of things. People are pitching you business ideas that are not good business ideas. Right, you make $1 million, but like you're not getting $1 million. You're getting half of that with taxes and stuff like that. So you're not getting as much as you think you are. Most of them only get paid during the season. So they have some consumption smoothing problems where they're getting $1 million in the fall, but like nothing in the spring. So that, right, they spend way too much in the fall. They don't have it. Trying to think about some of the other just like wild things that were in there. Oh, one of the really big ones is actually, it's almost like a conspicuous consumption problem where you have you have friends on the team that are making 5 million and you're making 1 million, but like you don't want to look like it's like relative poverty where they're like spending more to like match the other person. So yeah, I know a little bit about the background because I had asked Abdullah and Darshak about that paper of like why they didn't have clips on critical comments. And they said that when they had written the paper that they had reached out to ESPN to get approval for the copyright because they wanted to try to do it kind of the formal way. And like basically ESPN just like absolutely shut them down. They were like, do not do this. We will sue you if you put this online, like because it's owned by Disney. All right, so ESPN is owned by Disney, and Disney is incredibly aggressive with their copyright claims.
And I will tell you, I've started economics of Star Wars. Mm-hmm. We have it on Critical Commons. We didn't ask.
Yep.
I mean, Disney, if you want to send a cease and desist, that's fine. I promise you, the 3 academics who are making zero money off of publicizing Star Wars will publicize. I mean, come on, this is fair use 101.
Yeah.
So, if you say cease and desist, right, we're going to stop. But I don't think they want that news coverage.
Yeah. Well, and that's why they never put them on there. And then the reason you see the ones for Broke is because I presented at Susquehanna on financial planning and using scenes from Broke to teach financial planning as one of your teacher workshops.
Yep.
Cecil probably did. I assume it was Cecil who invited me. But yeah, the 30 for 30 series is amazing. So if you're an economics educator, absolutely download Darshak and Abdullah's paper, and we'll link them and everything. It's so fascinating to see the clips that they've matched up. I would love for them to do a second paper because I think they did that like only with like the first 2 seasons, and like ESPN has made more. So I would love to see them do like a follow-up paper to that. It's so good. There's such good stuff.
Yeah.
I use 2 of them in my sports class. I use Who Killed Small Potatoes, Who Killed the USFL. Have you seen that one?
I haven't.
So good. So do you remember the USFL? Like the old one, not the current one.
Oh, no,
with Herschel.
Yeah. Jim Kelly, Herschel Walker, Steve Young. That was just it. Literally, the USFL collapsed right before I was 10 and really started watching football. The first season that I was like, I saw game 1 and I was like, oh my gosh, how was this not in my life before? Was when I was 10 years old, and that was 86. So
Small Potatoes it's a really good one. It kind of goes through like how they set it up, where to go, who the owners were, and then where it collapses. So if you read the summary, you'll find out it's actually really funny who killed do you know who killed the USFL? Or who they
I know. Blame. I mean, if I'm gonna have to guess, it's Trump, right?
Trump. Yeah, it's basically all. But this came out right like decades ago, like this, or not decades ago. This documentary came out like way before. I mean, I guess he's been talking about running for president for a while. It came out in 2009, so like it's older. But essentially, I'll give away the ending. Trump became an owner of the Generals in New York.
Yep.
And lobbied the other owners to move from a spring league to a fall league and compete with the NFL. And then basically they couldn't. And then they just made no money and then had to go bankrupt. So it's such a good documentary. And then the second one that I show and I really like is called, oh my God, I lost it right in the middle of it. It's about SMU. Paying players like the
yeah. I mean, when they had Eric Dickerson and
it's called Pony Excess.
Because they were called the Pony Express.
Pony Express. It's called Pony Excess. It's all about like how they started paying players and like the collapse of that. And all. So I show both of those in my class.
This is one that I don't show in the class. I'll give a second example. A book that, speaking of broke as being kind of a moving ESPN 30 for 30, but it's New Money Staying Rich. It's Philip Buchanan, who's a former first round draft pick. Yeah. Could add this to one of your 52 books. But it's just, it's stunning to me. And I mean, part of me thinks, right, part of game theory is like mechanism design. How do you set up rules? And so my thought process is like, what can the NFL do to help players? So, I mean, because if you're a first round draft pick and you live off of $200,000 a year, you should essentially be set for life by being a first round draft pick, even if you fail miserably in the NFL. But you hear of the stuff and like grandmother comes by and literally grab the wallet and saying, look, just seeing how much you have and pulling out money and just taking it. Right. I mean, look, it's stuff like that. No, are you kidding me?
Universities have gotten better. Because the NFL wasn't really doing anything. And so I think a lot of the universities started to make the players go through basically financial planning classes of like, hey, you're about to go from $500 a month of your stipend to $50,000 a week when you get to the NFL. So I think they've taken on a lot of that.
Yep. And I know that Chris Hogan, former radio host on the Ramsey Network and best-selling author and kind of a financial coach, and he's coached professional athletes, and he says that it's been very helpful, but he says I can't tell you, but some of the questions that I'm asked I can't even believe, and it's so I mean so there's work there, and I know like they're bringing in people like that. I'm like, that's good, right? So and there are many professional athletes really have heard that message and are doing great work. But if you're looking for an interesting book really about all the challenges, I think that a lot of professional athletes face in terms of this windfall of money and why do so many end up going broke. New Money Staying Rich is a pretty good book.
And then the other side, right? You have all the healthcare stuff. That was the big thing that came out with Hamlet, was that he hadn't been in the league long enough that like he likely won't get healthcare coverage later. Like you have to be like, I think you have to be in for like 5 years to get vested or something like that.
Okay.
And so right. Those are all those sorts of complications where like you could play 1 year, make the minimum, only get half of that, and then like have like a debilitating injury for the rest of your life. Like those are sorts of things that are just wild.
Yeah.
But I'm going to call it pop culture because it's a book, because I think this is still media, so I'm gonna give it a media.
Book is media.
Books are media. I'm gonna recommend Soccernomics. My sports econ class will be reading this. This is the latest edition of Soccernomics. They came out with it, I think, the first time about a decade ago, and they updated it a couple times with World Cups or Olympics. This is the 2022 World Cup edition. So I think, it was published last year, but I think the data at least kind of goes up to the end of 2021. And there is a section in here about, it's called Happiness, essentially on like why hosting major sporting events, Olympics and stuff like that, makes people happy. So even though it's called Soccernomics, it is primarily about soccer. They do talk about a bunch of other sports. So they'll reference Moneyball and baseball. They'll talk about the Super Bowl. Yep. They talk about the difference between American football and European football. So it's I think it's a really good book. And Stefan is a sports economist. Simon is a journalist. Stefan is super knowledgeable about.
That's cool. I've added it to my list. I think I've seen probably you posting about it, but I think I've seen it, but I'm adding it to my queue. You say you go for 52 when you read more. probably get about half that. I think I probably get about a book every other week. Maybe a little bit more. I don't know, but I don't get 52 a year like you do.
Well, so if you want another sports book, I just started reading this. It's in my signature on my email, so I have to open my email to tell you. Actually, I remember it now. I just started reading this. I've only read like 5 chapters, but so far it's been very, very good. And I think it's going to still finish really, really well. It's called This Is Your Brain on Sports. It is a behavioral economics cross of sport, like behavioral economics with sports, but it's kind of from like the fans' perspective. So like the opening chapter is essentially like, why is it that when you go to a sporting event, like if the team is awful, nobody's cheering, they're just kind of there, but they go wild for like a free t-shirt. Like, why do people like jump up and down and run, but they won't do that for the team that they claim that they love, but they'll do it for a shirt that says, like, it has like a logo sponsor. Like, you wouldn't have bought the shirt, but you will go wild for the shirt. So it's a nice like behavioral economics sports book. It's been good so far.
Good. I'll add it to the list. So,
yeah.
Any closing words of wisdom for our listeners?
Anybody who has made it this far in the podcast, if you have been listening for the past 45 minutes, we need you to click the share button and share this with people, and make sure that your friends are also listening as well, so that way we can have more people join in with these conversations. I've seen some really interesting stuff on Twitter. People have started to share and comment back and forth, and Matt and I absolutely love that. So I
gotta say, it's really cool to see people sharing and pointing out, saying, hey, you got to go to minute 26 because we were talking about this. So thank you to everybody who has been tuning in and recommending. And we're excited to do this, and hope everybody has a wonderful Super Bowl weekend. I hope your team is in it. Mine is not. I know that already.
I guess that's the nice part. Filming it so early, we know who's not in it. So by the time you're listening to this, we don't know who the teams are. So please don't fault us for that, as we filmed it weeks before the Super Bowl.
We should take an iteration where we each say, well, in the Super Bowl, it's these 2 teams, and go through every combination, and then we'll look really brilliant. But I think people would see through it. But anyways, thank you to everybody. We'll see you again in another couple of weeks.
Thanks, Matt. Cheers.
Thanks. Cheers, Jadrian.